The morning Abraham Underwood rode into Caldwell, Kansas, he had exactly 43 cents, a horse named Gideon who had seen better decades, and no particular place to be, which was precisely why, when old Roy Greer flagged him down outside the feed store and pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand, Abraham did not refuse it. He was the kind of man people trusted on sight, though he could never quite explain why. He stood 6 feet and a half inch in worn boots, with dark brown hair that the sun had kissed at the edges, and a jaw that looked as though it had been carved out of the same red Kansas sandstone that lined the creek beds. He was 26 years old, and he had spent the last 4 of those years drifting, not aimlessly, the way some men did out of laziness or cowardice, but deliberately, the way a man drifts when he is looking for something he cannot yet name. Roy Greer was at least 70, hunched at the shoulders, with white whiskers that grew in every direction as if they, too, were trying to escape. He squinted up at Abraham with the particular expression of a man who has been thinking about a problem for a long time and has finally spotted someone foolish enough to help him solve it. "You looking for work?" Roy asked. "I am not opposed to it," Abraham said. Roy pushed the paper into his hand. On it was written a single name in thick, slanted letters, Pauline Winslow. Below it an address, 3 miles east of Kiowa Station, past the second dry creek left at the dead cottonwood. "She needs help," Roy said, "at the ranch. Her father passed 2 months ago and she has been trying to hold it together on her own. Cattle are getting thin, the fence line is a disaster, and there is nobody out that way who will take the job." Abraham looked at the paper. He turned it over. There was nothing on the back. "Why will nobody take the job?" he asked. Roy looked down at his boots. "She is difficult," he said, which was the kind of answer that explained nothing and everything at the same time. Abraham looked east, toward the low brown hills that rolled away from town like sleeping dogs. He looked at the name on the paper again, Pauline Winslow, and something in him that had been very quiet for a long time stirred slightly, the way a bird stirs in its nest before the dawn actually arrives. "Which direction?" he asked. Roy opened his mouth to say something further, to perhaps warn Abraham or qualify the description or add some detail that might discourage him, but Abraham had already gathered Gideon's reins and clicked his tongue. He was moving east before Roy could finish drawing breath. It was the spring of 1882, and the Kansas prairie was doing the particular thing it did every April, which was making promises it would not keep past July. The grass was a green so fresh it seemed almost embarrassed, and the sky above it was the color of a robin's egg, and the wind moved through the new growth in long, slow sighs. Abraham rode with his hat pulled low and his eyes forward, and he read the directions from the paper twice, and he found the dead cottonwood enormous and silver pale, stripped of bark, standing alone on a slight rise like a monument to something, and he turned left. The Winslow property announced itself gradually. First there was the fence line, which Roy had been generous in calling a disaster. Several posts leaned at angles that defied engineering. 2 sections had fallen entirely, and someone had lashed them back together with rope in a way that was honest but not effective. The grass on the near side of the fence was good, and on the far side of it the same grass was equally good, which meant the fence was barely keeping anyone convinced it was a boundary. Then the house appeared on a rise ahead of him. It was a solid house, built from milled lumber rather than sod, which meant old Winslow had done well for himself at some point, or had been very optimistic, or both. The paint was white but had faded to the particular gray-white of old teeth. The porch ran the full width of the front, and on that porch, standing with her arms crossed and her chin lifted and her eyes absolutely fixed on Abraham, as if she had been watching him for the past quarter mile, was Pauline Winslow. Abraham brought Gideon to a stop at the gate. He pulled off his hat out of habit. He looked at her. She was not what he had expected, though he would have been hard-pressed to say what he had expected. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark auburn hair that she wore in a braid so severe it looked like a decision rather than a hairstyle. Her dress was practical and work-stained at the hem, and she wore boots that laced up the front and looked as though they had covered serious ground. Her face was angular and strong-featured, with a mouth that was currently set in a line that communicated, very efficiently, that she had not asked for visitors. She was beautiful in the way that certain landscape features are beautiful, not soft or decorative, but real and compelling and slightly intimidating. "Miss Winslow," Abraham said. "I did not send for anyone," she said. Her voice was clear and carried easily across the yard. "No, ma'am, Roy Greer sent me. Roy Greer should attend to his own business." "Yes, ma'am." He does give that impression and then does not follow through on it. Abraham looked around the yard. There was a barn to the left with a door hanging on a broken hinge, swinging slightly in the wind. There was a water trough that needed cleaning. There was a pile of fence posts stacked near the barn that had been there long enough for grass to grow up around their bases. "I am looking for work," he said. "I can mend fence, work cattle, do carpentry. I am not afraid of hard labor, and I do not require much conversation." Pauline Winslow looked at him for a long moment. Her expression did not soften exactly, but it shifted, the way the quality of light shifts when clouds move without quite breaking. "Everyone Roy sends quits within the week," she said. "I have not quit anything yet today." "You have not started anything yet today." "True," Abraham said. "Would you like to change that?" She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at Gideon, the way people who knew horses always looked at horses before they trusted the person attached to them. Whatever she saw in Gideon seemed to satisfy some calculation she was running. "There is a stall in the barn," she said. "Put your horse up. Supper is at 6 and not a minute past. You will sleep in the tack room. Your wages are $1 a day." She turned and went back inside the house without waiting for his response. Abraham looked at the barn door swinging on its broken hinge, and then he looked at the fence posts sitting in the grass, and then he looked at the road behind him and the flat Kansas horizon beyond it. He put his hat back on and rode toward the barn. Gideon, at least, seemed pleased with the accommodations. The first 3 days, Pauline Winslow treated Abraham Underwood with the particular brand of courteous indifference that was more exhausting than open hostility. She left a list of tasks on the porch each morning before dawn, written in a crisp, exact hand on brown paper, and she expected those tasks to be completed without supervision or complaint. She fed him twice a day, breakfast at 5:30 in the morning and supper at 6 in the evening, meals that were functional and nourishing and completely without ceremony. She answered direct questions with direct answers and offered nothing beyond that. Abraham did not push. He had spent enough time around difficult terrain to know that the worst thing you could do was charge straight at it. Instead, he worked steadily and without drama, fixing the barn door first because it was the most obviously urgent thing, then moving to the fence line, starting at the south end where the damage was worst. He worked from the first gray light of morning until the sky turned the dark orange of evening, and when he was done, he took off his gloves and looked at what he had accomplished and felt the specific satisfaction of work that was honest and visible and real. On the 4th morning, he found not a list but an actual problem. One of the longhorn cows, a big red-orange animal with horns that spread 3 feet to either side of her enormous head, had gotten herself into the dry creek bed to the north of the property and could not get herself back out. The banks were steep and crumbling, and she had churned the bottom into mud that went halfway up her legs, and she was standing in it with the magnificent, indignant patience of an animal that has decided the universe has wronged her. Abraham assessed the situation. Then he went to the barn and got rope. He was in the process of rigging a loop that he could use to encourage the cow up the east bank where the grade was most gradual when he heard boots on the grass behind him and turned to find Pauline standing at the edge of the creek. She looked at the cow. She looked at his rope. She looked at the angle of the bank. "The east side," she said. "The grade is best there." "I know," he said. She looked at him then, and something in her eyes changed slightly, a very subtle recalibration, like a compass finding north. "I will go down and get behind her," she said. "Miss Winslow, the mud is—" She was already picking her way down the bank. Abraham watched her wade into the mud without hesitation, her laced boots disappearing to the ankle, and he felt a sharp and unexpected feeling in his chest that he did not immediately recognize as admiration because it was so thorough it surprised him. Together, they got the cow out. It took 40 minutes and required Abraham to get into the creek himself, and it covered them both in mud that smelled like iron and old water, and the cow, once free, tossed her great head and walked away without a backward glance, as if the whole ordeal had been their fault. Pauline stood at the top of the bank looking down at her ruined boots. Her braid had come half undone. There was mud on her cheek. "She does that at least once a season," Pauline said. "She is the worst-tempered animal on the property." "Second worst," Abraham said, and then caught himself because that was not the kind of thing he said to employers. Pauline looked at him. He waited for her to be angry. Instead, very briefly, so briefly that he almost convinced himself he had imagined it, the corner of her mouth curved upward. "Go clean yourself up," she said. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes." Over the following week something changed, so gradually that neither of them could have said exactly when it started. Pauline began to linger at breakfast, asking questions about the work, not the anxious, checking-up questions of a person who does not trust the worker, but the engaged, interested questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand the work and had strong opinions about the best way to accomplish it. She knew the land intimately, which made sense because she had grown up on it, and she had opinions about everything from the best way to string wire on a tight corner post to the most effective grazing rotation for the southeast pasture. Abraham discovered quickly that her opinions were almost always correct. He also discovered that she was funny in a completely unanticipated way, dry and precise, delivering observations about the cattle or the neighbors, or the weather with a deadpan accuracy that made him laugh out loud before he had consciously decided to find it funny. She seemed surprised by his laughter, and then, after a day or two, seemed to be aiming at it. He learned things about her in fragments, the way you learn the topography of unfamiliar land by riding across it over many days. Her mother had died when she was 11. Her father, James Winslow, had been a serious and capable man who had taught her everything she needed to know about running cattle and very little about asking for help. She had 2 older brothers, both of whom had gone east, one to St. Louis, one to Cincinnati, and neither of whom had offered to come back when their father died. She had been 23 years old when she buried her father, and she had stood at the grave and looked around at 2,000 acres of Kansas prairie and decided, without drama and without anyone to tell, that she was going to hold it. "People thought you couldn't," Abraham said one evening. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become a habit in the way that good things become habits slowly, without announcement. The stars over the Kansas plain were extraordinary, thick and low-hanging, the kind of sky that city people never believe is real. "People thought I wouldn't," Pauline said. "There is a difference. Half of them thought I was capable and still assumed I would sell because I was a woman alone. The other half just thought I was foolish." "Which half does Roy Greer belong to?" "Roy is in a category of his own. He thinks I am capable, stubborn, foolish, and right all at the same time. He sent you, didn't he?" She looked at him sideways. "He has been trying to get someone out here for 2 months. He said you were difficult," Abraham said. She turned to look at him fully then. "And you came anyway." "You just asked which direction," he said, and did not add that this had been the most natural thing he had done in years. She turned back to the stars. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the coyote started up to the north, a chorus of high, wild voices that the darkness swallowed. "The men Roy sent before you," she said. 3 of them. They all had opinions about how the ranch should be run. They all knew better than me. The first one started moving cattle to a different pasture on his second day without telling me. The second one told me I should sell and let a man run things properly. The third one was drunk by the end of his first week. Abraham was quiet. He understood now what difficult meant, or rather, He understood that it did not mean what it was supposed to mean. It meant that she held the line. It meant that she did not make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. "I have moved exactly the cattle that you have told me to move," he said. "I noticed, and I am fairly reliably sober." "I noticed that too." She said it without any emphasis, which was its own kind of emphasis. She stood up, smoothing her skirt in the efficient way she had of closing conversations that had gone as far as she intended them to go. "Good night, Mr. Underwood." "Good night, Miss Winslow." She went inside. He stayed on the porch a few minutes longer, looking at the stars, feeling something warm and complicated settle in his chest like a coal that had just caught. The trouble arrived in the second week of May in the form of Harlan Dodd, who rode onto the Winslow property on a Tuesday afternoon, while Abraham was in the south pasture, mending a section of fence that had given up the fight entirely. Harlan Dodd was 40 years old, well-dressed in the way that ranchers who had recently become wealthy tended to be well-dressed, with polished boots and a hat that cost more than most men made in a month. He ran the Double D spread, which bordered the Winslow property on the north and east, and he had been, according to Pauline's sparse account of local history, making offers on the Winslow land since before her father died. Abraham heard the voices from the south pasture. He did not hurry, because hurrying uninvited into someone else's confrontation was not the kind of man he was. He finished the section he was on, driving the last staple cleanly, and then he walked back toward the house at a regular pace. Dodd was at the porch steps. Pauline was on the porch. The geometry of it was immediately legible. He was positioned to be above her if she came down, and she had stayed on the porch to avoid exactly that. "The offer is more than fair," Dodd was saying. "More than fair for land that is being poorly managed." "The land is not being poorly managed," Pauline said. Her voice was absolutely level. 2,000 acres is a significant holding for a woman alone. "Then it is fortunate that I am an unusually significant woman." Abraham walked into the yard and stopped a neutral distance from both of them. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which accomplished what he intended it to accomplish. Dodd looked at him. "Who is this?" "This is Mr. Underwood," Pauline said. "He works for me." Something moved across Dodd's face, calculation mostly, with some irritation underneath it. He looked at Abraham the way a man looks at an obstacle measuring dimensions. "I am making this offer out of neighborly goodwill," Dodd said, returning his attention to Pauline. "Your father was a good man. I am offering you a way out of a situation that is going to get harder, not easier." "Mr. Dodd," Pauline said, "I have heard your offer. I have considered it. My answer is no, and my answer will continue to be no. I would appreciate it if you would accept that and go." Dodd looked at her for a long moment. He smiled, which was worse than frowning would have been. "You are just like your father," he said. "Stubborn as a fence post. I hope it serves you better than it served him." He tipped his hat to no one in particular and rode out. Pauline watched him go. She was very still. Abraham walked to the porch steps and stopped. "He has been at this a while," he said. "It was not quite a question." "Since before my father's funeral," she said. "He had a man at the church watching." She said it without particular bitterness, which was somehow more chilling than bitterness would have been. She had had time to absorb the fact of it. "Do you have a lawyer?" Abraham asked. She looked at him. "I have the deed," she said. "My father was very particular about the deed." "Good. Where is it?" "In the iron box under the floorboard in the kitchen." "Keep it there," he said. "Men like Dodd have lawyers of their own. When the offers stop working, they look for another angle." She studied him. "You sound as though you have seen this before." "I have ridden through enough of the West to know the pattern." He looked north, in the direction Dodd had gone. "He will not give up easily." "But you are not doing this alone anymore, so that changes the calculation for him." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, less armored. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "After the first week, you had no reason to." He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because the work is real," he said, "and because you are not difficult. You are just yourself, which is not the same thing at all." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was gold and horizontal across the yard, and it caught the copper in her hair where it had come loose from the braid, and she looked like something Abraham had not expected to find in any direction he had ridden. "Thank you," she said, quietly but completely. He nodded and picked up his tools and went back to the fence line, because that was the right thing to do. But he felt her eyes on his back for a long time after he turned away. In the third week of May, a man named Caleb Wheeler came to the ranch looking for work, and Pauline hired him after Abraham spoke with him for 20 minutes and said the man seemed honest and capable. Caleb was 31, raw-boned and quiet, with hands that were already shaped permanently by years of working rope and wire. He arrived with a bedroll and a mule and installed himself in the barn without complaint. With 3 of them working, the ranch began to reassemble itself in earnest. The fence line was complete by the end of the month. Abraham rebuilt the barn door properly, rehung on new hardware, and started on the roof, which had developed a leak over the winter that had been rotting the wood beneath it. He drove into Caldwell on the 1st of June for supplies, and Roy Greer was at the hardware store counter, and he looked at Abraham with the expression of a man who had not quite expected to be right. "Still there," Roy said. "Still there," Abraham agreed. "She hasn't run you off." "She has not tried." Roy studied him. "You like it out there." "I do." "And her." Abraham set his list on the counter and looked at Roy steadily. "I am going to need 6 rolls of wire, a box of staples, 2 pounds of nails for the barn roof, and a length of oak board for the tack room shelving." Roy grinned a slow, creaking grin. "All right then," he said, and went to gather the supplies. The nights on the porch had become something Abraham looked forward to with an intensity that he recognized was not entirely about the stars or the quiet. Pauline brought out coffee, or sometimes sweet tea in the heat of an evening, and they sat in the 2 chairs that faced the prairie and talked in the way that 2 people talk when they have stopped performing and started being. She told him about her childhood on this land, running in the tall grass that used to reach her waist before the cattle had cropped it short, how she had believed for years that the line of cottonwood trees along the East Creek was the edge of the world. He told her about Iowa, where he had grown up the 3rd of 5 sons on a farm that could not support all of them, and about the long road south and west after the war had changed everything. "You were in the war?" she asked. She meant the Civil War, which had ended in 1865 and still shaped everything, the way a flood shapes a riverbed long after the water has gone down. "I was 14 when it ended," he said. "Too young to go, but my 2 older brothers went. One came back wrong. The other didn't come back at all." She was quiet, listening. "The brother who came back, Thomas, he couldn't make himself fit anymore. Into the farm, into the family, into anything ordinary. He was restless and angry, and none of us knew how to help him. I watched him for years, and I told myself I wouldn't be that. And then when the farm couldn't hold all of us anymore, I left, and I took the road west, and I thought I was being brave. But I think sometimes I was just running from the possibility of becoming Thomas." Pauline turned her coffee cup in her hands. "And then you stopped running." "I got tired of the direction," he said. "East, west, north, south. After a while they all look the same when you're moving fast enough." He looked at the lamp glow coming from the window of the house. "This is the first place in 4 years where I haven't thought about what was over the next hill." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "I think about the next hill every day. I have to. If I stop thinking about what is coming, I will not be able to stay ahead of it." "That is a different kind of movement," he said. "That is not running. That is standing your ground and planning the defense." She looked at him then, and the lamp light from the window lit the side of her face, and he could see something in her expression that she had not quite decided whether to show him. Something open and a little frightened, the way a door looks when someone reaches for the handle from the outside. "Harlan Dodd came back while you were in town," she said. Abraham went very still. "What did he say?" "He was more aggressive. He said the offer would not stay open much longer. He implied, he did not say it directly, but the implication was clear, that it would be better for me to sell voluntarily than to have things become complicated." Complicated meaning what? He did not specify, but last spring the Harmon family 3 miles south had some cattle go missing. Half a dozen head over 2 weeks. They ended up selling within the month. She said it evenly, but her jaw was set. My father noticed the pattern. He talked to the sheriff in Caldwell about it. What did the sheriff say? The sheriff in Caldwell and Harlan Dodd play cards together on Fridays, she said. Abraham let out a long breath through his nose. He thought about what she had told him, about the deed in the iron box, about 2 older brothers in Cincinnati and St. Louis, about this woman, 23 years old, holding 2,000 acres against a man with money and connections and absolutely no ethical consideration of her at all. I am going to go see Roy Greer, he said. Not about supplies. Roy knows this county the way some men know their own kitchens. He will know who the honest men are. He paused. And I think you should write to your brothers. She stiffened. I will not ask them. You are not asking them to come and save you, he said. You are informing them of a threat to their family's property and asking them to be aware. They should know. Whatever they do with the information is their business. He looked at her. You have a right to tell the people who are supposed to care about you what is happening. She looked away. They chose not to be here. That does not mean they chose not to care, he said gently. It might mean they have not had sufficient reason to examine that choice. The silence stretched. A nighthawk went over in the dark sky above them, its call a descending cry. All right, she said at last. I will write. He nodded. Good. And Miss Winslow Pauline, she turned at her name, and the surprise of it was visible on her face, the way a person's face changes when they hear something they have been wanting to hear without knowing they were waiting for it. He had not used her first name before. He had not intended to now. It had come out of his mouth as the most natural thing in the world, which alarmed him slightly and did not make him regret it at all. You are not going to lose this place, he said. I am going to make sure of it. She looked at him for a long time, measuring something that was not his height or his strength or his usefulness as a ranch hand. Thank you, Abraham, she said. His name in her mouth was a different kind of thing than her name in his. He felt it in his sternum, like a chord struck on a resonant instrument, and he carried it with him into the tack room that night and slept better than he had in years. Roy Greer was more than willing to talk. He was, in fact, overflowing with information that had been waiting for the right listener, and he sat Abraham down in the back of the hardware store with a cup of terrible coffee and told him about Harlan Dodd with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a man who did not like Harlan Dodd at all. Dodd had come to the county in 1873, bought his first land at prices that were not entirely explained by his known income, and expanded by purchasing neighboring land from people who had experienced bad luck in remarkable concentrations. Roy named 6 properties in 9 years. Some had sold due to drought, some due to personal tragedy. At least 2 had experienced the kind of cattle disappearing incidents that Pauline had described. Has anyone ever taken it to a court? Abraham asked. Attorneys in Wichita, Roy said, but Dodd is a patient man. He does not rush things. He applies pressure over months and then he waits. He is speeding up with Pauline, Abraham said. He is. I think he expected her to sell within a week of her father's funeral. Roy shook his head. He underestimated her considerably. He did. Abraham drank the terrible coffee. Who is the nearest federal law, not county federal? Roy thought about it. There is a United States Marshal out of Wichita, man named Crawford, Sam Crawford. He is incorruptible on his worst day, which in this territory makes him something close to a miracle. How do I reach him? Telegraph from Caldwell. You tell him Roy Greer sent you, and he will respond. Abraham spent 20 minutes at the Caldwell telegraph office composing a message to Marshal Crawford in Wichita, detailing what he knew and what Pauline had told him, referencing the 6 properties Roy had named. The telegraph operator was a young man of about 18 who read the message as he transcribed it and looked up at Abraham with wide eyes. This is about Harlan Dodd, he said. Mind your keys, Abraham said pleasantly. The response came the following morning. Crawford would be in Caldwell by the end of the week. He was interested. Abraham rode back to the Winslow ranch with Roy's information and Crawford's reply, and a box of supplies that included a bolt of blue calico fabric that he had absolutely no professional reason to purchase, and that he tied to the back of his saddle with a careful knot, and did not think about too hard. He left the fabric on the kitchen table when he came in for supper. Pauline looked at it without speaking. He sat down and poured himself coffee, and she looked at the fabric again, her head slightly tilted. "I thought the kitchen curtains were looking thin," he said, which was true and was not entirely why he had bought it. She looked at him. Her expression was soft in a way it had not been at first, not vulnerable exactly, but open, the way good land looks after rain. "Thank you," she said. And then she turned to the stove and did not look at him again for several minutes, and when she came back with supper her cheeks were slightly pinker than the kitchen heat alone would explain. Caleb Wheeler, who was a man of considerable perceptiveness despite his silence, looked from Pauline to Abraham and then very carefully looked at his plate. The cattle began disappearing on a Thursday in the second week of June. It was not a random event. Abraham had taken to checking the outer fence line every morning from horseback, and on Thursday morning there were fresh marks in the soft earth near the north fence horse tracks, 3 sets, and a section of wire that had been carefully removed and then loosely reset so that it would not be noticed in a quick inspection. 3 longhorns were gone from the north pasture. He counted twice to make sure. He found Pauline in the kitchen and told her straight. She sat down, which was the first time he had ever seen her sit down under pressure rather than stand straighter. She sat for about 5 seconds, then she stood back up. "Who do you think it was?" she asked. "Dodd's people," he said. "It has his pattern," Roy confirmed it. "We cannot prove it." "Not yet," he looked at her. "Crawford arrives in Caldwell day after tomorrow. I think we should ride in and meet him together." She looked at him. "Together? You are the property owner. He should hear from you directly." She nodded slowly. "All right." She looked toward the north window in the direction of the Dodd property. Her jaw was set. "3 head," she said, and he could hear the full weight of what 3 head meant, not just the money but the message, the slow erosion that Dodd intended to make into a landslide. "They are not getting any more," Abraham said. "I promise you that." He spent Thursday and Friday nights in the north pasture, sleeping a few hours at a stretch near the repaired fence. Caleb took the south. Nothing else disappeared, and on Saturday morning he and Pauline rode into Caldwell together on Gideon and Pauline's gray mare Mercy, and Marshal Sam Crawford was waiting at the hotel. Crawford was not what Abraham had expected. He was slight and gray-haired, perhaps 55, with the kind of quiet authority that does not require physical size. He shook Pauline's hand the same way he shook Abraham's directly, without condescension, and he listened to everything she said with complete attention, and when she was done, he opened a leather notebook and wrote for 3 minutes without speaking. "Miss Winslow," he said finally, "I have had my eye on Dodd for 2 years. You are not the only person in this county to tell me this story. What I have lacked is a property that has not yet sold, with an owner who is willing to hold and testify." He looked at her. "Are you willing to hold and testify?" "I have been holding," she said. "Testifying is not something I expected to need to do." "Expect it now," Crawford said. "What you are describing, combined with what I know from other sources, is enough to bring a case. It will take time. It will likely require you to resist further pressure, and the pressure will very probably get worse before it gets better." Pauline folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me what I need to do." Crawford spent 2 hours with them. He left with a detailed written account of every incident Pauline could remember signed, and a list of dates and approximate values for the missing cattle. He told them he was riding to 3 other former Dodd neighbors in the next week. On the ride back, the afternoon was bright and windy, and Mercy tossed her head in the gusts, and Pauline rode with her back straight and her chin level. "He believed you," Abraham said. "He believed the evidence," she said. "That is better than belief." "Both, I think," Abraham said. She looked over at him. The wind had pulled strands of her hair loose from the braid, and they moved across her face, and she brushed them aside impatiently, and for a moment she looked entirely unguarded, just a young woman on a horse in the afternoon, without armor, without defense. "I could not have done this alone," she said. "I need you to know that I know that." He held her gaze. "You could have," he said, "but I am glad you did not have to." They rode the rest of the way in a comfortable silence, which was its own kind of conversation, one that said more than either of them was quite ready to say aloud. June deepened. The prairie turned toward its July gold, and the heat built in long waves that shimmered off the flat land to the west, and Abraham Underwood settled into the rhythms of the Winslow ranch with the totality of a man who is not planning to go anywhere. He fixed things. He fixed the tack room roof, and the water trough, and the squeaking board on the porch steps, and the latch on the chicken coop. He was good at fixing things, not because he was especially talented at carpentry or metalwork, but because he paid attention to the way things worked and the way they failed, and he found solutions that lasted rather than solutions that merely held. Pauline noticed this. She noticed everything he had come to understand, in the way of someone who has had to rely entirely on their own observation for a long time. She was teaching herself, he also noticed. She had a stack of books on the kitchen table, a treatise on cattle disease, a government pamphlet on soil conservation, a borrowed volume on grassland management from the Caldwell Public Library. She read in the evenings after supper by lamplight, with a cup of cold coffee at her elbow, and she made notes in a small leather-bound journal. She was planning 5 years ahead while managing today, which was remarkable and also exhausting, and sometimes he brought the second cup of coffee without being asked. "You do not have to do that," she said one evening, looking up from her book as he set the cup at her elbow. "I know," he said, and went back to his chair. She looked at his back as he walked away. He knew she did. He was beginning to know the weight of her attention the way a plant knows the direction of the sun, not with thought, but with orientation. "Abraham," she said. He turned. She was looking at him with that expression she had, the measuring one, but different now, more honest, less protective. "Tell me something true," she said. "Something you have not told anyone." He thought about it carefully because she deserved careful thought. "I spent 2 years after I left Iowa convinced that freedom was the most important thing, that it was the thing I had been missing. And when I was out here, riding from place to place, working for a season and moving on, I thought I had found it." He looked at the lamp flame. "But I think what I actually had was just absence. Absence of roots, absence of obligation. And I told myself that was freedom because I didn't know the difference yet." She was very still. "The difference," he said, "is that freedom is choosing something, not just refusing to be bound." She set her pen down on the journal. "What have you chosen?" she asked. The question was very quiet and very direct, the way she was always quiet and direct, and it landed on him with the full weight she had put behind it. "I am still in the process of choosing," he said. "But I am not confused about the direction." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and turned back to her journal, but there was a softness about her shoulders that had not been there a minute ago. "Good night, Abraham," she said. "Good night, Pauline," he said. He lay in the tack room that night and stared at the ceiling boards and thought about the fact that he was in love with Pauline Winslow, which was not a surprising thought so much as a complete one. The kind of thought that does not ask you to do anything immediately except acknowledge it. He acknowledged it. He held it up to the light of his own examination, and found that it was solid and real and serious, and not something he had any intention of doing poorly. In the last week of June, a letter arrived from Pauline's older brother Charles in Cincinnati. He was the one who had gone further east, who had married an Ohio woman and gone into the banking business, and his letter was long and formal and carefully written and contained, somewhere in the middle of the second page, an acknowledgment that he had been wrong to leave Pauline to manage alone, and an offer of funds to hire additional help and a lawyer if needed. Pauline read it at the kitchen table and then put it face down on the table and did not say anything for a full minute. "He sent money," she said finally. "That is useful," Abraham said. "He sent money," she said again, and her voice was complicated gratitude and grief and old anger and relief all mixed together. Abraham sat across from her. He did not say anything about what she should feel or how to interpret the letter. He just sat there, solid and present until she was ready to talk. "He left because he wanted a different life," she said. "I understood that. My brother William left the same way, quietly, with apologies that were more like explanations. And I watched my father watch them go, and I saw what it cost him, and I told myself I would never do that to him. And then I was the one left, and it was not a heroic choice. It was just not leaving was the same as staying, and staying was the same as everything I knew and loved." And she stopped. She pressed her lips together. "And then he died, and there I was." "You stayed," Abraham said. "That is its own kind of heroic." "It does not always feel heroic," she said. "It sometimes feels like being trapped by love." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what love is." She looked at him sharply, and he realized what he had said, or rather how much of what he meant had slipped through the professional surface of it. He held her gaze. He did not take it back. Something shifted in the room. The June heat was pressing against the windows. The lamp was lit even in daylight because the storm clouds had been building all afternoon, purple-green and huge. "Abraham," she said, and his name in her mouth was something different again now, not warm the way it had been before, not grateful but searching, like a hand extended in the dark. "Yes," he said simply. And then the storm broke. The rain came down in a wall, hammering the roof and the porch and the yard, and Caleb came running from the barn shouting about the south fence, and the moment cracked open and dispersed into the noise of rain and urgency and boots on the porch floor. They spent 2 hours in the storm moving cattle away from the South Creek bed, which was running fast and cold with the sudden rain, and by the time they were back and the stock was secured and everyone was soaked to the bone, and the storm had passed in the dramatic way of Kansas summer storms, leaving a sky rinsed to a clear, exhausted blue, the particular charged moment in the kitchen was gone. But it had not been forgotten by either of them. The 4th of July brought the whole county together in Caldwell for a celebration that included a parade of local veterans, a barbecue behind the church, and a square dance in the evening at the town hall. Pauline had not attended in 2 years. The year her father died she could not, and last year she had not felt like it. But this year Caleb had been making noises about going since early June, and Abraham had said nothing about it, and she found herself, on the morning of the 4th, brushing her hair out and thinking about what to wear. She wore the dress she had worn to her father's birthday last year, dark blue cotton with a white collar, and she put her hair up properly instead of braiding it, and she came out of the bedroom to find Abraham in the kitchen in a clean shirt she had not seen before. He had clearly made an effort. His hair was combed. He had shaved. He looked at her when she appeared in the doorway. He looked at her in the specific way a man looks at a woman when he has been trying not to look at her and has momentarily forgotten to maintain the effort. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said, and he was not only talking about the ride to Caldwell. The town was full of color and noise. There were flags on every porch and children running in every direction. The parade was led by a brass band that played with considerable enthusiasm and imprecise accuracy, and Abraham stood next to Pauline on the boardwalk and watched it go by, close enough that the back of his hand nearly touched the back of hers. Roy Greer found them at the barbecue and shook Abraham's hand and hugged Pauline with the careful formality of an old man who has not hugged anyone in a while and is not sure of the protocol. "You look well," he told Pauline. "I am well," she said, and meant it in a way she had not meant anything in a long time. The square dance started at 7 in the evening in the town hall, which was draped in red, white, and blue bunting, and smelled of sawdust and candle wax, and the particular warm smell of a lot of people in one place in July. The fiddle player was a tall man named Jonas who had been playing at every town dance since before anyone could remember, and he started with a reel that had everyone on the floor within the first 30 seconds. Abraham danced. This surprised Pauline, because she had not imagined it, and she stood at the edge of the floor watching with a peculiar feeling that she identified after a moment as wanting. He was a good dancer, not showy, but solid, with the natural rhythm of a person who has spent years working in time with the physical world. He danced the first reel with the Greer granddaughter, who was 17 and delighted, and the second dance with the Methodist preacher's wife. And then Jonas called out a waltz, and Abraham crossed the room to where Pauline was standing and held out his hand. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. His expression was earnest and a little unguarded, the face of a man who has made a decision and is holding the door open. She put her hand in his. They waltzed. The hall was turning slowly around them, other couples in lamplight and the sweet slide of the fiddle, and she was very aware of his hand on her waist and her hand in his, and how solid he was, and how being held by him in even this formal, public way felt like something she wanted to memorize. "You can dance," she said. "My mother made all 5 of us learn," he said. "She said a man who could not dance was only half civilized." She was right. She was right about most things. He turned her gently, and they were facing the open doorway now, the warm July night visible beyond it, the stars beginning to appear above the town. She could see the prairie from here, the flat, dark edge of it beyond the buildings, and it looked the way it always looked to her, like home, like responsibility, like the realest thing she knew. "I have been thinking," he said. "You think constantly," she said. "I have noticed. I have been thinking about something specific." His voice was quieter now, meant only for her. She turned her face slightly toward him. "I would like to stay," he said, "not as a hired hand." Not, he paused, looking for the right word with the carefulness she had come to recognize in him. "Permanently, if you are willing." She was quiet for 2 full measures of the waltz. "Permanently in what sense?" she said. He looked at her then fully, without the careful management he usually applied to the way he looked at her. "In every sense," he said, "all of them." She felt the breath go out of her and then come back. "That is not a small thing to say," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is exactly the size it is." The fiddles sang on. Around them people turned and laughed, and the children wove through the dancers with their sparkler sticks, and the night was warm and full. "I am not easy," she said. "I told you that at the beginning." "You told me you were difficult," he said, which was never true. "I am serious and stubborn, and I have opinions about everything." "Yes," he said, "I know, I admire it." She looked at him for a long time, this man who had ridden east without knowing her and stayed without being asked to and chosen without being pushed. "Ask me properly," she said. "Not on a dance floor." He nodded, and his eyes were warm, and the waltz ended. He asked her on the porch on a Sunday evening in the last week of July, which was honest timing, not a special occasion, not a grand production, just the end of a day on the land they had both worked, the sun going down orange and red in the west, the coyotes starting up in the far dark. He had thought about how to do it for 3 weeks. He had not planned a speech, because speeches were not his nature, and they were not hers either. He sat beside her in the porch chair and looked at the sunset, and then turned to look at her. "Pauline," he said. She turned to look at him. She had known this was coming. She was too perceptive not to have known, but the anticipation of a thing and the thing itself are different, and her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "I love you," he said. "Completely. Not the way a person loves a place or a season or a habit, but the way you love something that changes you into more of what you were meant to be." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me. I am not asking because you need someone to hold this land with you, though I will do that as long as I draw breath. I am asking because my life is better with you in it than without you, and I want the kind of life that I am not planning to leave." She looked at him. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were bright, and he knew her well enough now to understand that the set jaw was not resistance, but the thing she did when she was feeling something too large for a soft expression. "You said you came west because you didn't know what you were looking for," she said. "Yes." "Did you find it?" "Yes," he said. "It is this, you here." She held his gaze for a long, searching moment, and then she said, "Yes," and it was the most complete word he had ever heard anyone say. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat that way while the last of the light left the sky, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas plain, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more for a while. They were married in Caldwell on the 15th of August, 1882, in the church at the end of Main Street, with Roy Greer and Caleb Wheeler and the Methodist preacher's wife as witnesses, and a congregation of perhaps 20 people who had come because news in small Kansas towns travels efficiently. Charles Winslow wrote a letter congratulating them and enclosed a second sum of money, which Pauline accepted with more grace than she would have managed 6 months before. The other brother, William, sent a short note from Cincinnati that contained more warmth than his usual correspondence, and Pauline read it twice and put it in her journal. Abraham moved his few possessions from the tack room to the bedroom. This took approximately 6 minutes. Pauline watched him do it with an expression that was half amused and half something tender and private. "You do not have very much," she observed. "I have everything I need," he said. "I find that adequate." She handed him half the space in the wardrobe without being asked, and he hung his good shirt and his second pair of trousers and considered himself home. The weeks after the wedding were both ordinary and extraordinary in the specific way of new marriage. The same work, the same land, the same kitchen and porch and endless prairie sky, and underneath all of it a new current, warm and constant, like a spring that had always been there and had finally found the surface. They disagreed about things, the pace of fence repair, the best route for moving cattle to the east pasture in summer, whether the ham should be salted before or during the smoking process, and the disagreements were honest and direct and generally ended in one of them being right, and the other acknowledging it with grace, though not without character. They were, Abraham discovered, remarkably well suited to each other in exactly the ways they had not been certain they would be. Pauline's seriousness and his steadiness did not cancel each other out. They complemented each other, her forward-thinking calculation matched by his capacity to be present in the current moment, her tendency towards solitude balanced by his easy sociability when they went to town. She was funny, privately, in the way he had first noticed but now knew more completely. She had a gift for silence that he had been raised to believe was exclusively a male trait, and a capacity for physical work that exceeded what most men he knew were capable of. And she was gentle with sick animals and fierce with anything that threatened her. And she had a way of seeing clearly into the middle of complicated things that sometimes made him feel like he was in the presence of something that operated at a higher resolution than ordinary. He loved her more completely every week, which had not been something he expected, because he had already believed himself to be in love with her completely when he proposed. He was learning that love, actual love, did not have a ceiling. Marshall Crawford returned to Caldwell in September with federal papers. He had built his case over the summer, collecting testimony from the former owners of 3 neighboring properties who were willing to speak, and the investigation had produced evidence connecting Dodd's men to the cattle disappearances that had preceded multiple land sales. The case was not simple. It wound through the courts for months, but it moved steadily, the way things move when the right people are pushing them from the right direction. Harlan Dodd stopped making personal visits to the Winslow Ranch in October, after receiving formal notice from Crawford's office that the Winslow property was under federal observation. He was a cautious man, ultimately, which was what had kept him unprosecuted for as long as he had been, and he understood when the ground was shifting. The Doubleday continued to operate its legitimate cattle business, and Dodd was polite when Abraham met him in Caldwell, which was the politeness of a man who has recalibrated a threat. By the following spring, Dodd had been indicted on 2 counts related to fraudulent coercion in land transactions, stemming from testimony gathered from the Harmon family and 2 others. He did not go to prison. The law in 1883 was complicated, and the reach of justice was imperfect, as it always was in those years, but he paid a significant fine, and his ability to operate in the county was severely curtailed, and he sold the Doubleday within 18 months and moved to Colorado. Roy Greer reported this development with a satisfaction that bordered on spiritual. The Winslow Ranch, by then, had a new name on the fence post at the gate: Winslow Underwood. Pauline had insisted on keeping Winslow. Abraham had insisted she keep it. They had agreed without argument, which took about 4 minutes. Caleb Wheeler stayed. He turned out to be indispensable, which Abraham had suspected from the beginning. He had a gift with cattle that went beyond skill into something closer to intuition, and he never wasted words, and he fixed things the first time, and he was the kind of man whose presence made everything around him slightly more reliable. He built himself a proper room at the far end of the barn over the winter, with a wood stove and 2 windows, and he settled into the ranch the way good timber settles into a frame, quietly, permanently. Abraham rode to Wichita in the spring of 1883 to register the formal land deed under the combined name, and to meet with an attorney Crawford had recommended, a man named Hofstetter who specialized in property law, and was not, to Abraham's satisfaction, a man who played cards with anyone in a position of local law enforcement. The deed was clean and clear and properly documented, and Abraham brought it back and put it in the iron box under the kitchen floorboard, next to the original deed in James Winslow's careful handwriting. He told Pauline about it that evening on the porch. She looked at the new deed for a long moment, then placed it back in the box and closed the lid. "Father would have liked you," she said. "I hope so. He would have tested you first," she said, "put you to work in the south field and watched how you handled the mare, asked you uncomfortable questions over supper. I would have answered them. I know." She put the box aside and looked at him with the full, direct attention she gave to things she considered important. He worked his whole life for this land to be something lasting, something that would outlast him. She paused. "I think it will now." "I know it will," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a simple thing, not a dramatic one, but Pauline Winslow had not been a person who leaned on anyone for a long time, and she did it now with the particular ease of something that has finally reached its right position. He put his arm around her, and they watched the evening come down over the prairie, and the land stretched out before them in every direction, patient and vast and theirs. Their first child was born in February of 1884, a boy they named James for Pauline's father, which was Pauline's idea, and Thomas for Abraham's lost brother, which was Abraham's idea, and between those 2 names was the whole weight of what they were building, not something new that had no roots, but something living that grew from the roots that had come before. James Thomas Underwood arrived in the world during a snowstorm, delivered by the Caldwell midwife, who had ridden 6 miles through blowing white to get there, and done the whole thing with the brisk competence of a woman who has long since stopped being impressed by difficult weather. Pauline was exhausted and fierce and absolutely characteristic throughout, which was the only way she was capable of being. Abraham held his son for the first time at dawn, when the storm had passed and the world outside was white and silent and brilliant. James was red-faced and blinking and seemed to be evaluating his surroundings with a thoroughness that was already familiar. "He looks like you," Pauline said from the bed. "He looks like himself," Abraham said. "That is the best thing you can look like." She reached out and touched the baby's hand, and the baby gripped her finger with the automatic, complete grip of the newborn, and Abraham watched the 2 of them and felt something so large it did not have a name yet. Only later would he find the word for it, which was fullness, the sense of a thing being wholly complete. James grew the way children grow on working ranches, which is fast and physical and curious. He was walking by the time the spring roundup happened, and by the following summer he was toddling out to the barn behind Abraham with the purposeful instability of a small person who has decided on a direction. Caleb Wheeler, who had no family of his own, took to the boy with a grave affection that manifested as making him small wooden animals and lifting him up to see over the fence rails. In the spring of 1885, Pauline discovered she was expecting again, which she told Abraham on the porch in the straightforward manner. She handled all information of consequence. And Abraham kissed her on the forehead and then on the mouth, and said they would need to extend the house before winter. And she said she had been thinking about exactly the same thing, which was how their conversations generally went. The extension added a second bedroom and a proper sitting room on the south side of the house, with windows that looked out toward the Cottonwood Creek, and Abraham and Caleb built it over the summer with lumber from Caldwell and a roof line that matched the original. Pauline directed the layout with the precision of someone who had been mentally redesigning the house for years. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1885, and they named her Margaret Rose Margaret for Abraham's mother. Rose for no one in particular except that Pauline said it was the right middle name, and she was not wrong. Margaret arrived with considerably less drama than James had, as if she had attended to the stories of her brother's entrance and decided on a more efficient approach. She was dark-eyed and watchful from her first days, and grew into a child who observed everything and spoke selectively, and had her mother's absolute precision of thought in a face that was unmistakably her father's. The Winslow Underwood ranch continued to grow. Not rapidly, not recklessly, but steadily. The kind of growth that comes from consistent good management and genuine knowledge of the land and the animals on it. They added a third pasture rotation in 1886, based on a system Pauline had read about and adapted for Kansas grass conditions, which kept the grazing pressure balanced across the seasons. They increased the herd by 40 head over 2 years without overextending the carrying capacity of the land, because Pauline could calculate carrying capacity the way other people could calculate simple arithmetic automatically and without error. Charles Winslow visited from Cincinnati in the summer of 1886. He came with his wife, a quiet Ohio woman named Eleanor, and he stood on the porch of the house and looked out at the land and was visibly moved by something that he found difficult to articulate, which Abraham suspected was the compound feeling of recognition and guilt and pride all arriving at once. He and Pauline had 2 days of careful, honest conversation, the kind of conversation that is possible only between people who have put off having it for long enough that they have no patience left for pretending. Some things were said that were hard. Some apologies were made that were sincere. By the end of the second day, they were not the way they had been when he left. That was gone, and it was right that it was gone, but they were something new, something honestly constructed from the people they had each become. Charles held his nephew James on his knee at supper and told him about Cincinnati in terms a 2-year-old could appreciate, which mostly involved descriptions of extremely large buildings, and James listened with his mother's seriousness and seemed to find the buildings credible. Eleanor Winslow, it turned out, was not a quiet person so much as a person who required a reason to talk. She found reasons quickly. She and Pauline spent a morning together in the kitchen and an afternoon together looking at the pastures, and by evening they were deep in a conversation about soil and planting, and whether vegetables could be grown commercially in the creek bottom that Abraham followed for a while and then surrendered to, because it had grown detailed in ways that exceeded his expertise. Charles and Eleanor left on a Thursday morning in July, and Charles shook Abraham's hand on the porch and looked at him with the eyes of a man who has finally understood something he should have understood earlier. "Take care of her," he said. "She doesn't need me to take care of her," Abraham said. "She needs me to stand beside her. There's a difference." Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I see that now." He looked at Pauline, who was on the porch holding Margaret and talking to Eleanor. "I see it very clearly." He and Eleanor drove away in their hired buggy toward Caldwell, and Abraham stood on the porch next to his wife and watched them go. "That was good," Pauline said. "Yes," he agreed. "Painful and good." "Yes." She shifted Margaret to her other hip. Margaret grabbed a strand of Pauline's hair and examined it with intense scientific interest. "He is not coming back to the land," Pauline said. "He loves his life in Cincinnati. That is honest. I can accept an honest thing." You could not accept the other kind, Abraham said. No, she said. I never could. He put his hand on the small of her back, and she leaned slightly, just slightly, into his side. Roy Greer died in the winter of 1887, quietly in his home above the hardware store at 74 years old. He had been declining for months, and it was not a surprise, but it was a loss that sat differently than expected losses sometimes do. He had been the one who had written Pauline's name on a piece of paper and handed it to a stranger, and the whole weight of what that small act had set in motion settled on Abraham at the funeral with a force that made him need to stand very still for a moment. He told Pauline this afterward on the ride home. She listened. He was a meddlesome old man, she said. Yes, I am glad he meddled. As am I, Abraham said. She reached over from Mercy's back and put her hand briefly over his on Gideon's reins, and then straightened and looked ahead at the road home. Gideon, who was 19 years old and had the philosophical patience of a horse who has carried a person through a great deal and expects to continue carrying him for the foreseeable future, plodded forward through the February cold with complete reliability. The ranch in the late 1880s was not without difficulty. No honest account of working land in Kansas in those years could be. There was a drought in 1887 that turned the grass brown by June and kept it there until September, and they lost 4 head to the heat and sold another 8 earlier than planned rather than watch them deteriorate. There was a hard winter in 1888 that froze the water trough solid for 3 weeks and required the hauling of water by bucket from the creek break every morning, which Abraham and Caleb did without complaint and which Pauline did alongside them, because she was not the kind of person who allowed others to bear a difficulty she could also carry. Through all of it the ranch held. The land held. The deed in the iron box under the kitchen floorboard remained clean and clear, and the boundary fence stayed repaired, and the cattle numbers recovered, and the grass, as Kansas grass always does, came back. James grew into a boy who loved the horses with an unsentimental competence that Abraham recognized as innate talent. By the time he was 4, he was feeding Mercy from his hand without being told, and by 5, he had developed an opinion about saddle placement that was not wrong. He was not a loud child. He had his mother's quality of stillness when he was watching something, but he was not solemn. He had a sudden, brilliant smile that appeared rarely enough to be noticed, and always surprised people who had not yet seen it. Margaret, by contrast, was a child who seemed to have been born with strong opinions about everything and a firm intention to communicate them. She spoke early and well and a great deal, and she had the family gift for being right most of the time, which was charming at 3 and would be formidable at 30. Abraham loved watching her talk. She had the same jaw set as her mother when she disagreed with something, and he had to be careful, sometimes, not to laugh at the wrong moment. On a summer evening in 1889 June, the prairie in its best month, green and gold, the air carrying the particular clean smell of Kansas grass after a week of good rain, Abraham and Pauline sat on the porch after the children were in bed. James was 5 and Margaret was 3, and the house had the specific quiet of young children who have finally surrendered to sleep after considerable negotiation. The stars were out in full. They were always extraordinary, the stars over the Kansas plain, and Abraham had never lost his sense of their particularity. The way the Milky Way poured across the sky from east to west, thick and personal, as if it had arranged itself for the specific benefit of anyone sitting on this porch. 7 years, Pauline said. He looked at her. She was looking at the sky. 7 years since you rode up that road, she said. I thought you were another one of Roy's useless suggestions. You thought I would quit in a week, he said. I thought you would quit in 3 days. You seemed she tilted her head considering, too comfortable in yourself. Most men who are comfortable leave before things get complicated. I was not actually comfortable, he said. I was very uncertain about a number of things. She looked at him, amused. You never showed it. You never showed yours either, he said. I showed all of it, she said. You just knew how to read it. He thought about that. Yes, he said, I suppose I did. She leaned her head back and looked at the stars. Porch boards were warm still from the day's heat, and the crickets were going in the grass, and somewhere in the dark a single tree frog was announcing itself near the creek. I used to sit here alone, she said. After my father died, every evening, I would look at that. She gestured toward the horizon where the land met the sky in a clean, dark line. And I would try to feel the whole thing, the size of it, the responsibility, all of it, and then put it down again, so it wouldn't crush me overnight. Did it work? Sometimes, not always. She was quiet for a moment. It is different now. The size of it is the same. The responsibility is larger, actually more cattle, more to lose, the children. She paused. But the weight of it is distributed between us. That is, she stopped. That is everything, he said quietly. She turned and looked at him with the full force of her attention, which was never a careless thing and which he had never taken for granted and never would. I love you, she said. She said it the way she said every important thing, directly, completely, without softening or decoration. I know, he said. I love you too, without qualification or reservation or end. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat that way while the stars turned overhead. The whole enormous sky reflected faintly in the dark water of the creek to the east, the land around them quiet and real and permanent. Caleb Wheeler, who was 38 years old and not a man given to personal announcements, came to breakfast on a Thursday morning in April of 1889 and said, without particular preamble, that he intended to marry the widow Mrs. Sutton from the farm 3 miles north, if she would have him, and that he wanted to know whether there was still a place for him at the ranch if he moved into her house. Pauline said yes before he finished the sentence. She said there had always been a place for him and always would be, and that if Mrs. Sutton preferred, he spent his days closer to home that could be worked out, and that she hoped he would bring his wife to supper soon. Caleb said thank you in his spare way and went back to work. He married Martha Sutton at the Caldwell Church in May, a small quiet ceremony that suited both of them entirely, and he continued to work the Winslow Underwood ranch from Tuesday through Saturday, and spent Sundays and Mondays at the Sutton farm, which was a satisfying arrangement for all concerned. James Underwood was 11 when the decade turned, and by then he was a real hand, not a child who helped, but a genuine working member of the operation, who could assess a sick animal and mend wire and ride Mercy or the newer sorrel gelding they had bought 2 years previous with equal competence. He had also, by then, exhibited a gift for numbers that had led Pauline to spend considerable energy procuring books from the Caldwell Library and writing to a school in Wichita that had been recommended by Crawford, who had stayed loosely connected to the family through occasional correspondence. He should go to school, Pauline said, properly, more than what we can give him here. He should, Abraham agreed. They were sitting at the kitchen table with James's sum spread out between them, and the work was well beyond what either of them had expected. Crawford mentioned a school in Wichita. I wrote to them last month, Pauline said. He looked at her. She looked at him. He should have known. He wants to go, she said. I asked him. He wants to go and also to come back. He was very clear about both. That sounds exactly like him, Abraham said. It sounds exactly like us, she said. Margaret, at 7, was already the most opinionated person in any room she entered, including rooms that contained adults who were far more practiced at having opinions. She had decided that she was going to learn to read Latin, which was an ambition Abraham respected enormously and could not personally assist with, and she had enlisted the Methodist preacher to teach her the alphabet of it. And she arrived home each Friday afternoon after her lesson with new vocabulary that she deployed in conversation, until she had extracted every possible reaction from everyone available to react. She had also, at 7, taken it upon herself to conduct an inventory of every item in the barn and to report discrepancies in the supply of nails and rope in a small notebook that she kept in her apron pocket. Caleb took this seriously and consulted it when making supply lists. Abraham had once expressed mild amusement about the notebook, and Margaret had looked at him with a steady, serious look that was her mother's exactly, and he had not expressed amusement since. The morning of James's departure for the school in Wichita in September of 1892 was a full and complicated event. He was 13 years old and taller than his mother and still shorter than his father, and he stood in the yard in his good clothes with his case packed and his face composed in the way he managed emotion, which was by holding it very still and letting only the eyes speak. Pauline hugged him for a long time without saying anything. Then she stepped back and looked at him and said, "Write me on Fridays, tell me everything. Do not keep anything back to protect my feelings." "Yes, ma'am," he said. Abraham shook his hand. Then he pulled him in and held him for a moment, hand at the back of his head. "You know who you are," he said quietly. "That is the only thing you need to take with you." James nodded. His composure was entirely intact until Caleb Wheeler came forward and put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing at all, just stood there for a moment with that grave, steady affection, and then James had to look away briefly at the middle distance. He climbed into the wagon that would take him to Caldwell for the train, and he turned and looked back at all of them from the wagon seat with that sudden, rare, brilliant smile, and they all raised their hands, and he turned forward and did not look back again because he was his mother's son and his father's son, and he knew how to choose a direction and commit to it. Margaret stood beside Abraham as the wagon went down the road. She had not cried at the departure, which was characteristic. She had only become more precise. "He will come back," she said. "He will," Abraham agreed. "He said so. He keeps his word," Abraham said. "Like his mother." Margaret considered this. "Like you too," she said. He looked down at his daughter. She was looking at the road where the wagon had gone, her small, serious face tilted slightly, the morning light catching the copper in her hair that she had from Pauline. "Yes," he said, "like me too." The years continued to pass in the way that good years pass, which is not slowly or quickly but fully, each day complete in itself, the seasons marking time on the land the way they had always done, the grass coming and going and coming back again, the cattle moving in their slow rhythms, the fence holding or needing repair, the sky doing everything a Kansas sky could think to do and then doing it again. James came home for Christmas and for summer, and each time he was taller and more formed, his mind growing in the directions that school was offering him while his hands remembered every fence post and cattle trail on the home land. He wrote on Fridays without fail long letters in his compact, clear handwriting about mathematics and history, and a teacher named Professor Allen who had introduced him to the principles of surveying, which James found to be the ideal intersection of numbers and land. Margaret turned 12 and then 15 and made her opinions about everything available to everyone within conversational range. She developed, in her early teens, a surprising passion for the cattle breeding side of the operation. Not the physical work of it, though she did that too, but the theory of it, the logic of genetic selection, which she had encountered in a newspaper article about experimental breeding programs, and had approached with the intensity she applied to all subjects. She wrote a lengthy letter to the United States Department of Agriculture requesting information about research programs, which Abraham sent for her without reading aloud from it because he knew she would have asked him not to. The Department of Agriculture wrote back. She was 15 years old, and they addressed the letter to Mr. M. Underwood, and she accepted this without comment and filed the correspondence in her notebook. In the spring of 1896, a young man came to the ranch looking for seasonal work. His name was Henry Park, and he was 20 years old and from a Korean family who had come to Kansas through California, and he had been working his way across the state for 2 years learning cattle ranching. He was quiet and thorough, and had excellent references from 2 ranches to the west. Abraham hired him after talking with him for half an hour. Pauline talked with him for 20 minutes about the east pasture drainage problem and hired him before Abraham had finished making the decision. Henry Park was, in the way of the best people, exactly what he appeared to be: capable, honest, hard-working, and possessed of a natural ease with the animals that Caleb recognized immediately and respected, which was the most significant endorsement available on the Winslow Underwood ranch. He stayed through the summer and into the fall, and it was in September that Abraham noticed, with the attentiveness of a parent who has been paying attention to his children since before they could walk, that Margaret found reasons to be in whatever part of the ranch Henry Park was working with a frequency that exceeded coincidence. He mentioned this to Pauline privately. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things he had noticed significantly later than she had. "I know," she said. "Since when?" "July. And Henry, he is very respectful and very careful," she said. "He goes out of his way not to presume. He is 20, she is 16. I know how old they are," she said. She looked toward the barn where both of them were separately attending to unrelated tasks. "She is 17 in November. They are both young. We were not ancient when we met," she said. "You were 23 and I was 26. And my father had been gone for 2 months and I was running 2,000 acres alone. Age is not only a number." She paused. "I am watching. There is nothing to address yet. If there is ever anything to address, then we will address it," she said, "together, clearly, as we always have." He nodded. He trusted her assessment as he had trusted her assessment of most things for 14 years. She saw people clearly without the distortions of hope or fear, and she was not careless with her daughter. Henry Park left in October to winter with his family in Dodge City, and he came back in the spring of 1897 and asked Abraham directly, man to man, on the porch one morning if he might be permitted to write to Margaret. He was 21. Margaret was 17. He explained himself without embarrassment and without pretension. He had serious intentions. He respected the family deeply. He wanted to do things properly. Abraham listened to all of it. Then he said he would speak with his daughter and his wife, and that Henry would have an answer by the end of the week. Margaret, when asked, turned the color of a Kansas sunrise and said yes with a composure that took visible effort. Pauline, when asked, said that Henry Park was an honest young man of good character, and that Margaret was entirely capable of making her own assessments, and that the correspondence could proceed under the understanding that nothing was decided and everything was possible. Henry wrote. Margaret wrote back. The letters were private and Abraham did not inquire about their contents, because privacy was something he had respected in his children as a matter of principle. James wrote from Wichita to say that he had met Henry in passing and thought well of him, which was James's way of giving his quiet blessing. James came home for Christmas of 1897 and announced, over supper on his first night back, that he had been offered a position with the Kansas State Land Survey Office in Topeka and planned to accept it, and that he was also, he said, somewhat less casually, engaged to a young woman named Clara Reeves, a schoolteacher from Wichita whom he had been seeing for 8 months and had not mentioned in letters because he had wanted to be certain. Pauline set down her fork and looked at her son with the full precision of her attention. "Tell me about her," she said. He did. He told them about Clara Reeves for 40 minutes, and it was clear from the way he talked about her that James Underwood, who was careful with words, had found someone he was not careful with, someone he spoke of freely and warmly, and with a certainty that had nothing uncertain underneath it. Abraham looked across the table at Pauline while James talked, and she looked back at him, and in her eyes he saw what he felt, which was the specific joy of watching a child become the fullness of what they were capable of being. Clara Reeves came to the ranch in March for a week's visit. She was 20, the daughter of a schoolteacher herself, with direct eyes and a quick mind and the particular gift of really listening. She and Pauline got along immediately, which was not a foregone conclusion. Pauline did not give ground on her standards, and Clara did not seem to think she should have to, and they found, after a day, that their standards were essentially the same. Clara looked at the land with the appreciation of someone who had grown up in a town and recognized the work visible in the ranch's condition. She asked genuine questions. She helped with the breakfast dishes without being asked. She sat on the porch in the evening and listened to the prairie with the attentiveness of someone encountering something significant. "She is good," Pauline told Abraham privately. "She is right for him," he said. "Yes," Pauline said. "That is the same thing in the end." James and Clara were married in Wichita in June of 1898, a proper ceremony in a proper church, and Abraham and Pauline sat in the front pew and watched their son take the hand of the woman he intended to hold onto for the rest of his life. And the ceremony was both its own thing and a mirror of something they recognized. Margaret, who was a bridesmaid in a blue dress that was the same shade as the Kansas sky in autumn, caught Abraham's eye from her place at the altar and gave him one of her rare, sudden smiles, and he felt his chest fill up past measuring. The summer of 1898 was a good one. The grass was generous and the cattle prices were decent, and Henry Park had become a permanent fixture of the ranch operation in every way that mattered except the formal one, which was settled in September when he asked Abraham for Margaret's hand in a conversation that was both nervous and honest and covered, in the course of 20 minutes, Henry's financial situation, his family background, his intentions, and his complete awareness that Margaret Underwood was a person of formidable character who would make her own decisions regardless, but that he wanted to ask properly because it mattered to him to do it right. Abraham said yes. Margaret, when Henry asked her, privately, on the same porch where so many of the defining moments of this family had taken place, in the golden September evening, said yes, with considerably more composure than he expected and considerably more feeling than she showed. But he was learning to read her, which was the most important skill available to anyone who intended to spend a life beside her. They married in October, a small and genuine ceremony at the Caldwell Church, and Henry Park became, in the way of things worked out rightly, a partner in the ranch operation, not an employee but family. By the turn of the century, the Winslow Underwood Ranch had grown to include a third hand, a proper bunkhouse built to the east of the barn, a new windmill that fed the water trough without manual effort, and a herd that was twice the size of what Pauline had inherited in 1882. James was in Topeka with Clara, who taught at a primary school and was expecting their first child. Margaret and Henry were in the house that Abraham and Caleb had built on the south quarter of the property over the summer, a good solid house, properly finished, with windows that faced the morning light. Abraham and Pauline were 44 and 41. The prairie around them had not changed in any way that mattered. The sky was the same sky. The grass was the same grass. The iron box under the kitchen floorboard held 3 generations of documents now: James Winslow's original deed, the Winslow Underwood deed, the survey certificates, the letters from Marshall Crawford, and 3 of Roy Greer's supply receipts that Pauline had kept for no reason she could entirely articulate except that Roy had been important. They sat on the porch on a September evening in 1900, the first cool night of the first autumn of the new century. The last of the light was going out of the west in long horizontal bands of gold and rose, and the first stars were appearing, faint and then brighter, over the dark line of the prairie. Pauline had a letter in her hand from James, announcing the birth of their son, a boy named William James Reeves Underwood, which was a long name for a small person and suited him apparently already. The letter was detailed and warm, written in James's compact hand, and contained a description of Clara in the aftermath of birth that was both accurate and deeply loving, and a single line at the end: "I understand now what it cost and what it meant." Abraham read that line twice. He understood what James meant. He meant everything: the choosing of a place, the staying, the holding of something through difficulty, the willingness to be changed by the thing you love. "He is going to be a wonderful father," Pauline said. "He had good examples," Abraham said. She turned and looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them was the whole long truth of 18 years. The mud in the creek bed and the porch in the summer stars and the dance floor in Caldwell, and the morning he had asked her to marry him, and the morning James was born in the snowstorm, and every morning after, each one arriving with the faithfulness of mornings and offering the same thing, another day on this land together. "We did well," she said. "We did," he agreed. "All of it." She gestured, a sweep of her hand that encompassed everything visible, the house, the barn, the south fence line visible in the failing light, the grass, the sky. "All of the things we did not know we could do." "I knew you could do them," he said. "You knew I was not difficult," she said, and there was humor in her voice, the dry, precise humor that had first surprised him into laughter in the kitchen of this house nearly 20 years ago. "Not even slightly," he said. She took his hand. Her hand was strong and warm and had the particular roughness of someone who worked real land, and he held it the way he had held everything she had given him, with care, with gratitude, and with the absolute certainty that he would not be letting go. The coyotes started up to the north, the same wild chorus he had first heard on this porch before it was his porch, before she had said yes, and before they had built the life visible in every direction around them. He had always liked that sound, its wildness, its honesty, its complete indifference to anything human, which made it the truest voice the darkness offered. Pauline leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the house on the Winslow Underwood ranch in the first September of the 20th century, and the stars came out over the Kansas plain one by one, the way they always had, the way they always would, enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to anything except being exactly where they were. This was the life. This was the thing that Roy Greer's piece of paper had set in motion, a name, a direction, a man who asked which direction and left before anyone could say more. It did not seem a small thing now. It seemed, in the quiet and the starlight and the warmth of his wife beside him and his daughter in the South house, and his son's letter in the kitchen, and the whole solid, breathing, continuing fact of everything they had made together, like exactly the size thing it had always been. Which was the largest kind?